We can also check in with our breathing. Just however it's happening, it's fine. We don't need to manage it. It doesn't need to be controlled in any way. We can allow the body to do what it knows how to do, and sit back and watch. Watch the body receive the breath, move with the breath. Internally feel the sensation of the breath, movement of the diaphragm in our belly. Again, see if there's any point in that movement where we're holding tension. Okay, if we find that we get pulled away, distracted at any moment, we can always use the breath to come back to as a point of grounding into current experience, into the present moment. So since we've done this quite a few times now, we can just check in directly with awareness. So in this case, since we're already watching the breath, we can notice that there's the breath happening, and then there's also noticing that the breath is happening. So this is different than mindfulness. Mindfulness is more focused on the breath and staying focused on the breath. What I'm pointing to here is really stepping back more fully into that awareness, where the attention is more in the awareness rather than in the object of the awareness. So just come back into that awareness as spaciousness, let's say. Spacious noticing. Awareness prior to whatever content may be arising within that awareness. So in this moment, since we've already pointed to the breath, we can see that there's awareness and there's the breath as an object within awareness. Right? Might also be thoughts occurring. Even though thoughts feel like they're internal to us, we can actually view them much like any other object, where we notice them, and there's something that notices them and something that's noticed, namely the thought. So we can look at thought in this case very much like we might look at a chair across the room and another object within consciousness. So this is what I mean by just stepping back into that awareness prior to any content. So that awareness is undisturbed by content. So whatever content might be arising, maybe a thought, maybe a feeling, maybe a bodily sensation, there's still awareness present that notices all of those sensations, thoughts, objects. So we can just sort of step back into that awareness where the attention is more on that spaciousness and maybe less so on the objects that are appearing within it. The objects may still appear, it's not a problem. We can let them be, but we can pull the attention back, just gently back into the awareness itself. That openness within which all of that content arises. Okay, everybody good with that? All right. What I thought we could talk about tonight is emptiness and unity. So two big topics. And we'll get to the unity part at the end. We'll see how that's related to this topic of emptiness. Emptiness is a term that may not be all that familiar in Western religions or Western psychology. It doesn't really have a direct corresponding theory within Western psychology, within Western culture. So it can take a bit of work to sort of delve into what is actually being meant by the term emptiness, which comes from Buddhism, Eastern cultures, Zen, etc. So emptiness, when you say the word, you know, as it comes out in English, sounds like empty, right? Empty, void of existence, non-existent. And if we take it to be that, it can be a scary term, like, you know, I'm working with my sense of self, and I've heard about this thing called emptiness, and do I really want to step off the cliff into oblivion? Well, that would be scary, right? But it's not actually what the term means at all. It's a term that's often interpreted as being that, but it's not actually the meaning of it when it's examined closely. So let's just take a simple example. We'll take a glass of water, and we pour the water out, and we could say, now the glass is empty. So the question is, empty of what, right? Well, in this case, it's empty of water, but it's still a glass. It's still now filled with air or moisture. You know, so it's not exactly empty, but it is empty of what we were calling it full of before, namely water. So this is really what we'll be talking about, just looking more deeply on how we're identifying things that we take for granted in a conventional sense, where we're just conversing like we do out in the world, and then looking more deeply at the actual reality of it. So this is not to deny the existence of anything. It's really to look at whether things that we look at both outside and as a body-mind has a separate, independent existence. So that's really what we're talking about, whether that independent, separate existence is our true nature, or is it something that's not, well, not separate, not separate, not permanent, not divisible from the rest of existence. So that's the territory that we'll be looking at. So let's take, we'll move from inanimate objects to non-human plant objects to humans. That'll be the direction of the talk, only because it's easier perhaps to see things in inanimate objects first, and then we'll go from there. So let's just take, let's say we are out in the parking lot, and we say to somebody that we've met in a parking lot, I'm looking for my car. I'm looking for my Buick in the parking lot. Okay, so if you're an American and you're an adult, you know, you have a somewhat idea of what a Buick is, right? So you could say, make a statement like that, and the other person is probably able to relate to it. But when we really start looking at the statement, we can see it's just sort of a broad term, and it doesn't really specifically define what we're talking about. So it's a name. Buick is a name that's applied to something that we have in mind, something that clearly exists. It's in the parking lot somewhere. I've got the keys to it in my pocket. But what exactly is that? So we can look at it, and first of all, in terms of the name, we can say, well, you know, what kind of Buick? You know, what model? How old is it? How many miles does it have on it? What features does it have? What color is it? You know, we can begin sort of clarifying what this name that we've assigned it to actually means in a little bit more depth. Right? So we can see right away that this term Buick is just a concept about, you know, sort of a whole family of possibilities that may exist in the parking lot. Okay. So if we, let's say we can consider this vehicle in the parking lot. I mean, at what point does it become a Buick? So now we're talking about creation and dissolution, right? So at what point does it become a Buick? You know, so we're in the Buick factory, and there's parts and they're being assembled. You know, if it's just a pile of parts in the warehouse, we couldn't really convince anybody by pointing at the pile of parts that it is a Buick at that point. So at some point, we begin to assemble it, and you know, we put the engine in. You know, is it a Buick then? How about when we put the seats in, or the tires on, or, you know, a final inspection sticker? You know, when we think about it, you know, by calling it a specific name, that is totally dependent on our own human definition of it. There's nothing inherent to that whole process of when it becomes eligible to be called that name or not. Okay. Now, the same is true on the dissolution end, where you know, it's no longer functioning. It's parked in the driveway, but it doesn't run anymore. Then it starts to rust. Then you take the engine out, etc. You know, plants start to grow through it. You know, at what point does it cease to become a vehicle? You know, so we can see that there's not a clear point of creation, not a clear point of dissolution. It's part of this process. We also see that it's impermanent. Even during its useful lifespan, it's you know, gaining mileage, maybe getting a few more scratched, you know, staying on the carpet, etc. You know, so we can see that there's an impermanence even within its own lifetime. We can also see that the car as an assembly of parts isn't really an independent entity, because it's totally dependent on that whole supply chain of parts being assembled somewhere in the world, transported, invented, designed, inspected, you know, brought to the factory to be assembled. You know, so that whole process, you know, with the, you know, shipping containers and the people involved in the creation of those, all of those are a necessary part of the process to end up with a completed vehicle. So the completed vehicle, you can't say is independent of that whole almost infinitely extending chain of events that was necessary to bring all of that together to end up with a vehicle that we can call a Buick in this case. Okay, so there's also in terms of Eastern religions, we can talk about this sense of emptiness as dependent origination. It means the same thing. So dependent origination means in this case that what we look at as a separate individual entity, individually existing entity, namely this particular vehicle, is actually dependent on this entire process and everybody that worked on the cars and their schooling and their parents and on and on and on, the sources of materials, etc., all were necessary to end up with this entity that we can begin to question whether it has a separate existence or it's dependent on everything that went before. The other element that makes it a little more, less solid in a way, is to recognize the veil through which we're looking at it. Right? So even just simply, observing the car, we're standing right next to the car, we're not looking at the whole car, we're looking at maybe the left side or maybe the right side, or maybe the hood, but we're not looking at the engine, or we're looking at the outside, but not the inside. I mean, so there's not any place that we can be that we can see the entirety of the object that we think is solid and permanent. And even more importantly, the veil through which we're looking at the object, in other words, our opinion about this particular model of car, whether we had good results with it in the past or not, whether we ever owned one or not, whether we know a lot about cars and know all the technical details, or whether we just think of it as something to ride around in and have people be impressed by it or not, whatever. Okay, so it's all of those factors are held uniquely by each person. So two people with different histories about cars in general, about this particular kind of car, whether they own this car or not, or whether it's just their friend's car, are looking at the same apparent object, but are seeing it through two quite different lenses, right? Does that make sense? So one person can have a relationship with the car. Maybe they're the car's owner. Maybe, they've had problems with it. Maybe they can't afford the mortgage payments. So there's a relationship that they have with a vehicle that the person that they're talking to doesn't have. So we can see that even an object where two people are looking at the same apparent object, they're not having the same experience, the same internal experience of that object. Okay. All right. So this may sound a little mundane so far. So, but it's relevant to looking at the same kind of analysis, applying the same conditions to determine the separateness, the individual identity of an object. So we'll move a little closer to home. We'll take a animate object. Let's take a plant. Let's take a corn plant, for example. So what we call a corn plant, we can say a word like that and everybody has some idea in their mind about what we're talking about. But we can ask at what specific point did that corn plant become eligible to be called a corn plant in our mind? Okay, so we have a corn kernel, hard thing like a piece of popcorn before it's popped. And, so most people would say, no, that's not a corn plant. That's a corn kernel, a corn seed. So we add some water, a little warmth. And then at some point, there's movement in that kernel and there's a sprout begins to emerge. But we can see the difficulty of sort of assigning a specific instant at which we could say, well, now it's a corn plant. Before it wasn't, but now it is. Okay, and we can see that kind of distinction is totally mind-based, right? You know, from the kernel's perspective, it's a evolution, it's a movement. There's no specific point where it's this and not that. You know, the potential existed in the kernel, the realization of it happens through this process. So there's not a specific point that you could say, okay, now it's a corn plant, and have everybody agree on it. So we can see it's a man-made term, man-made distinction. You know, and then even during the course of the plant's maturing and fruiting, you know, we can have a little sprout of a corn plant, we can have a knee-high plant, we can have a tall green plant with eventually with some tassels, eventually with a corn cob or two. And so that's, you could say that's in a growth, but you could also say that's a movement of impermanence. So for every growth, you know, to be a tall plant, it has to give up its sprouthood. You know, it has to let go of what could once be characterized as in order to move along. Okay, so at some point the ears are on the corn. So now we can all agree, okay, now it's really a corn plant. Okay, what if we take the ear off of the corn? It's still a corn plant? It's different. But we can see that any distinction, it is totally a matter of definition. So at some point the corn plant ages, begins to die and turn brown. You know, if it still has the ear on it, those ears will start to dry. The kernels will no longer be suitable to eat corn on the cob style, but there'll be dried kernels. And eventually the ears will be picked, the corn will be left to fall back on the ground or be tilled up and resupply the soil with organic matter. So again, on the cessation end, at what is there ever a point where that we can say, well, that's no longer a corn plant if it's tilled into the ground? But in a sense, there's again no point of distinction other than a mental conception about it. So we can say this whole process is a process of impermanence, which allows change, which allows growth, maturing. So often impermanence is presented as a negative thing, like, oh no, everything's impermanent. Yes, everything's impermanent. That's why everything can move, change, be alive, grow. And eventually, all forms are impermanent. All forms are a temporary coming together of prior causes and conditions, right? So in the case of a corn plant, the prior conditions had to do with the presence of the corn kernel, had to do with someone saving the corn kernel from a prior year, you know, tilling the soil, having nutrients in the soil, you know, weeding the garden, planting a garden in a climate that's suitable for growing corn, you know, having a good growing season, etc. So all of those things are necessary for the arising, the coming into existence of a corn plant. It's not that it didn't exist prior to that, it just didn't exist in a particular form that we could label corn plant. So every prior condition and cause that was necessary for the corn plant to arise. The warmth, the carbon dioxide in the air, the rainfall that came from clouds, that came from the oceans, that came from the rivers, the decomposed plant material in the soil that gave it the nutrition to support the growth of the corn plant. All of those were prior conditions. All of those were necessary for the arising of this form that we assign a label, corn plant. Okay. So, we can see that, again, we're talking about not a separate independent existence of this one particular plant. It was dependent on everything that went before. And if we track that back far enough, it is connected, actually not even connected. It's completely dependent on everything in existence. We can track it back to, if we take it back far enough, has been a necessary precondition for the existence of this one plant. Okay, we can also see, like we did with the vehicle, we can also see that what is perceived by a human looking at a particular corn plant is different based on the lens through which we're viewing it. Whether we're a commercial farmer, thousands of acres, planting GMO crops, etc., or we're, a backyard farmer hoping to grow a few ears of corn for Sunday dinner. So it's through those conceptions that we're also maybe viewing the same object, but seeing it quite differently. And even that seeing of the corn plant, I mean, we can, all say in a conventional way, well, I see the corn plant there, but we actually never see a corn plant or anything else for that matter. What we register is the light reflected off the corn plant that our eyes are able to receive, convert into electric impulses that are transmitted to the brain. The brain reconstitutes that signal into an image that it can recognize and assign a label, corn plant. Okay, so even from that perspective, we're not actually directly engaged with what we take to be a separate, intrinsically existing object within our awareness. Okay, so these are just methods of analysis, just using our logical abilities to really look deeply at the nature of things. So it's important not to go to the extreme and say, well, if it doesn't meet these criteria, then are you saying that the corn plant doesn't exist? No, not saying that at all. No, we get to pick the corn cob and put some butter and salt on it and eat it. The corn plant exists. It just doesn't exist as a separate entity, right? It doesn't possess a separate self independent from everything else. So that's the essential distinction here. So that's really what emptiness means. It's empty of this separate self characteristic, but it's not non-existent. Still exists, just doesn't exist in the way we typically talk about it. So this doesn't mean, if you're out in Iowa and you're talking to a farmer who's raising corn, you can just say, you got a nice looking cornfield. We can talk conventionally about this. There's no harm done, right? It's just that if we believe that that is actually how things are, that can lead us astray. And we can see how that happens more clearly when we talk about this form, this body-mind. Okay, so again, emptiness doesn't mean non-existent. It just means empty of separate self, empty of separate existence apart from the rest of the totality of existence. Okay, so finally we can talk about human forms. So humans, we can sort of characterize different aspects of ourselves. Okay, so one aspect is we have a body, right? We also have sense perceptions, sense organs, you know, touch and smell and hearing and sight, etc. We also notice if we, you know, just check in internally, we have feelings and emotions. And we also have what could be called mental concepts, you know, ideas, beliefs, opinions, memories, regrets, hopes, dreams, fears, all of that. Any kind of mental construction that are, you know, being fabricated in the mind and possibly believed. Right? And then the fifth thing is just this mental processing that the human brain is capable of. So this is the processing that can take in information, process it either consciously or unconsciously, and take action or not, again, consciously or unconsciously. So this sort of processing ability of the humans. Okay, so let's look at each one of these individually based on these same criteria. So first thing is we can talk about the body. We can say, well, it's my body. You know, there's you know, a sense of a particular relationship with this particular body that I can sense into it. And so I have a greater degree of interest in this body than maybe other bodies. You know? So, but we can also see that this body, you know, when we talk about, well, does it have a specific point of origin or a specific point of dissolution? You know, typically we can call these birth and death, but you know, when we really look at that more closely, you know, the body didn't come into creation at the moment of birth. There was, or certainly 9 months of from fertilization to birth, and there was, you know, a genetic history prior to that. There's also the infusion of beliefs and conditionings that we've all received even before birth, culture that we were born into, etc. So again, we're not able to really pinpoint a start and a finish to the body. We presume that the moment that, let's say we're brain dead or some medical criteria, at that moment that the body ceases, but the body's clearly there still, but it's changed its form. But we've been changing form continuously every moment along the way. So in every moment, there's something like a million cells a second that die in our bodies and are regenerated. And that's what the body does to regenerate itself. And approximately every 7 years, almost all the cells in our body are replaced. And yet we infer a continuity of meanness to this body. We can also see that the body is totally dependent on air, water, food, warmth. It can exist for really short periods of time in the absence of any one of those things. We can also see that the body, even at a cellular level, is composed of non-human elements, namely food that we ingest that is, processed by the bacteria in our stomach and taken into our bodies as nutrition. Cells are rebuilt by that. So we can see that, we as human bodies are dependent on plants. They're dependent on water. They're dependent, and those in turn are dependent on an infinite number of things that were required to create those forms. So again, we're talking about dependent origination. These bodies are dependent on all kinds of conditions and causes that allow this body to come into this form for some period of time. We can see that the body's impermanent over a period of time. And we can also see that what we think of as this body is filtered through the thoughts that we have about it. Maybe we like it, maybe we don't. Maybe we wish that it was different. Maybe I wished I was taller or thinner, or, whatever our opinions about our body might be. So we have this filtered relationship with the body. It's not actually the body itself. The body, that sense of self isn't housed in the body, right? It's a mental attitude towards the body. It's a mental concept about the body. We can also look at just our sense organs, right? Our sense perceptions. We talked before about not ever seeing the corn plant. Everything is received by the sense organs and transmitted into the body. So we can look at these sense organs themselves and see that there's not a sense of self in them, right? They are, they receive information, that information's registered, and information's passed on, right? But there's not a sense of self. There's not like, the ear isn't telling the nose, I'm jealous of you because of whatever. The eyeball isn't saying, I'm the highest of all the senses, and you lesser senses. There's not that personal aspect to them. So we can't look at these sense organs and say that is where the sense of self is housed. Doesn't feel like that. Okay, we can also look at feelings, emotions inside. So it can feel like we're getting a little closer to home, right? So feelings and emotions are transient. They tend to, have a lifespan. They may be repetitive, but they're not unchanging forever. Maybe they, we find our sense of peace and happiness arising, and the next day, we're depressed and angry, and the next day it's different. So if there's that sense of impermanence there, there's not really solid ground to say, well, that's where my sense of self is housed. That feeling and those emotions are what I truly am, because it's always changing. It's impermanent. Which emotion are you talking about as being you? The one that's most repetitive. Then what happens when that emotion isn't present? So we can see that it's, sort of housing our self-identity in those emotions, even though they can feel very personal, is, well, it's just not a very productive way to define ourselves. If those emotions are a function of, somebody's rudeness, somebody got in our face and said something, and then, we internalize that. So we don't want to be in a position where we're outsourcing our sense of identity to whatever person shows up in our visual field, right? So we can see that emotions can also be affected by our thoughts. I mean, it's an easy experiment to do. You just be feeling pretty good on a nice spring day, sit out on the porch, and then remember some really difficult past occurrence that maybe hasn't been resolved. Still a spring day, right? Still just sitting on your porch, nothing else is happening, but that memory, when it comes in full force, can create a felt sense of emotions in the body. Right? So it's the thought can create the reality of that physical sensation. So these are all reasons why it's not appropriate to assign to our feelings and our emotions a sense of self-identity, right? As a separate, fixed entity. It's something that's always in flux, has a history to it, based on our prior conditioning, prior experiencing, our events in prior time in life, all colors what our emotional environment may be at any time. So if we assign that as being that is who I am a angry person, I am a happy person, I'm a nice person. However we equate that is maybe true sometimes, but it's not true all the time. It's not true all the time, it's not who we are. Whatever it is that we are exists as it is always. Okay, so that's not where we want to park our identity. Okay, so now we can look at mental formations, mental concepts. How about that? Is that where we want to park our identity? Well, now we're talking about memories, thoughts, beliefs, ideas, hopes, dreams, fears, what ifs, should haves, regrets, blame, judgments, all of that. All of those mental formations that were created, and to the extent that they're believed, they feel real. So is that who we are? Is that how we will define ourselves as a separate existing entity? I am the total, the sum, the package of all of my thoughts and beliefs. Is that who I am? That's what a lot of people think, right? But even over the course of a lifetime, we can see that those thoughts and opinions and judgments about ourselves and other people have changed. Those are also not impermanent. They're also of dependent origin too, that they're based on prior experiences, maybe childhood experiences, maybe things that our parents taught us that we've assimilated. So we can't even really say if those thoughts are entirely ours or are they just a form of conditioning. So again, is that a sufficient place to park our identity? Is that the self that I can be certain that I am? You know, and we can see it's subject to the same limitations as the inanimate object and the plant object that we looked at. It's not, we're not saying that those thoughts don't exist. We're saying that that's not the place of separate, independent existence apart from the totality of our experience and our ancestry, etc. Okay, and then finally we can talk about just the mental, local brain processing capability of us humans. And we can see that that too is conditioned by everything that went before. You know, there doesn't appear to be a beginning to that conditioning. You know, there was something that was passed down from our parents and from their parents, etc., from our culture, from our schooling, from our economic situation, our friends, our neighborhood, etc. Everything contributed to how that processing looks through the veil of this conditioning into the world and how it responds to that. So is that where we want to park our identity? So now, in terms of humans, you know, we've looked at the body, we've looked at sense perceptions, we've looked at internal feelings, we've looked at mental formations, concepts, and then there's just this processing ability of the brain to act consciously or through conditioning or unconsciously. You know, and we can see that, you know, when we look more closely, rather than look at it as a whole, you know, body-mind organism, but when we break it down to how these body-minds actually function, we can see that none of those aspects of ourselves have the characteristic of separate self-identity. You know, so in that sense, we can say that those forms are empty. Empty of what? Empty of a separate self, empty of a separate, independent existence apart from everything else. But that's precisely what we were taught, that what this form is, this overall package, is separate. You know, it all started when we were given a name. There was a unique name. It was a different name than mom or dad or whoever our caretaker was. You know, we began to realize, oh, wait a minute, I am separate. I'm separate from the people around me. I'm separate from my crib, separate from my toys, my siblings. So once we have that belief solidified in our, in how we view ourselves, you know, we come into spirituality and we hear that, well, what you need to do is, you know, get rid of your ego, you know, get rid of this sense of separate self. But if that's what we believe we are, you know, how do you even go about that? You know, if I believe that what I really am is a separate self, you know, where's even the motivation to try to eject that somehow? You know, how would I go about that? Who is being motivated to go about that? You know, so if we believe in its reality, there's really no way out. We can't sort of, by sheer willpower, or think it's because of our, it'll be to our spiritual advantage to get rid of this ego. It's not going to happen like that. We can't both believe it's real and want to get rid of it at the same time and hope there'll be any movement there. sort of like trying to push and pull at the same time. It won't happen. But what we can do is just look at and see that, as hopefully we have tonight, is just really look more deeply and see that that sense of being separate isn't as clear as we might have initially believed. To see that more and more clearly, because when an illusion is seen clearly, it drops of its own. If it's seen clearly, we don't have to try to make it go away. It just sort of evaporates because we see, well, it's just not true. So this sense of separation isn't like we're sort of violently getting rid of our ego, sort of cutting off a hunk of ourselves and tossing it out the window. No, it's just seeing that it was a misperception. That's what we're allowing to drop away. It's a misperception of who we thought we were. If we're thoroughly identified with our thoughts and beliefs and, emotional life, it can feel like, if someone says, well, spirituality is about letting go of this personalized, crystallized sense of self. It can feel like, threatened by that. Why would I even want to do that? So a lot of people are actually in that place in spirituality. There's an urge to go forward, and there's a hesitancy at the same time because of the specific misinterpretation of what emptiness means. It doesn't mean non-existence, right? It means that the sense of a separate individual self isn't actually true. Conventionally, sure, we can have a name, we can use the pronoun I, no problem, but it's helpful to really know that in a deeper level, it's actually not true. And if we really allow ourselves to consider that, I know we've gone pretty quickly through this tonight, and it's worthy of really consideration of looking deeply into our own nature and the nature of other things. Because this sense of emptiness, as I'm talking about, it applies to not only so-called outside phenomena, but also this sense of self. To see that it's empty, both phenomena and this personal package is empty of a separate self, independent from everything else. Okay, so this has implications, right? Has implications in our world, especially today. If we believe that we're separate, there can be motivation to take whatever we can take, treat the earth in disrespectful ways, not worry so much about consequences to other people, etc. We see the consequences of that in living color these days. Okay, if we can see that, well, that perspective is actually not true, then our sense of being in the world changes dramatically. So now there's a sense of, we can see it at least on a logical or even ecological way. We can see sort of a vague avenue towards unity of all things. We don't gain unity as sort of a faraway realization, even though it can happen as a realization, but we can sort of get in the neighborhood of it through this kind of analysis where we look and see that things aren't as distinct as we may have believed them to be. You know, both about the things out in the world and about our own personal self. You know, when we can allow our those edges to sort of soften a bit, we just become more available to that sense of being in this life as a part of it, rather than as a separate personal little somebody out in a great big world. You know, when we really sense into that, how we interact with other people, how we interact with all other beings, plants, animals, how we interact with river and soil and mountains and everything, air, is different, because we realize that all of that has contributed to what this body is today, all of our bodies. You know, when we can really fully sense into that, it's not even interconnectedness. You know, interconnected means you have separate things that are trying their best to, you know, play nice. It's way deeper than that. It's about non-separation from the get-go. You know, that we're not separate, that we are an evolving, moving, always in flux form of life. So this emptiness that can appear as a negative image to Western ears is actually what permits things to change, things to be impermanent, things to be dependent on almost an infinite number of causes and conditions that create this particular influx, impermanent, ever-changing form. That impermanence allows change. That change allows growth. That growth allows the possibility of realization, what we actually are. So I'll end with, there's a beautiful two-line quotation. This is from Nagarjuna, who's about a 3rd century Buddhist philosopher. So this is 700 years after Buddha, still refining the understanding of what was realized by Buddha 2,500 years ago. So the two-line quotation is, without emptiness, nothing makes sense. With emptiness, everything makes sense. So what we've been calling emptiness or dependent origination tonight, Thich Nhat Hanh is using the terms interbeing and dependent arising, right? Everything is related to everything else. Everything is not separate from everything else. The only thing that can separate all of that from what we feel is me, us, is our mind. A thought in our head that separates that too. No different than separating, you know, what we define as a corn kernel from a corn plant. You know, it's an artificial distinction that's not true. Our job isn't to try to get rid of ego, it's just to see that it's not actually true, never has been. Doesn't mean that we, you know, don't know what mouth to put our food into, doesn't mean that we won't turn around if somebody calls our name. We can still operate in the world in a conventional sense like that. Not to deny existence, it's just to look at what appears to be solid and real and independent by naming it, we can look at that more clearly and see that, well, that's actually not the whole story by any means. So, I mean, the mind wants to say, well, which is it? Is it you know, real? Is it, you know, not real? And it's all depends on definition again, right? It exists. You know, we can still eat the ear of corn, put it in our mouth, and you know, chew the beautiful kernels of corn. But we can also see that it's not a separate existing entity, independent of the rest of existence. So we just let those distinctions blur more and more, let them be seen through. And that seeing through those artificially created distinctions, the mind-created distinctions, is the revelation of unity. It can be seen as a mind-blowing event also, but it's really helpful to see the sort of ecological basis for it, that there's truth there as well. All right.